G'day guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about heart rate zones when running for beginners. So I'm going to give you a bit of my own insight with it, my experience, how I program for myself and my clients to save you the time and the research to applying this to your own training. So let's get started. So when it comes to applying heart rate zones or measures of intensity for your running training, the whole premise is that we're trying to achieve certain physiological adaptations. We're trying to improve fitness and performance whilst also reducing the risk of injury. For example, there's certain things that are going to happen when we're doing lower intensity running, where we're starting to utilize fats more as a fuel source, we're starting to move oxygen more efficiently around the body over time, versus when we're doing high intensity running and we're trying to clear lactate from our muscles, we're trying to use or become more efficient at utilizing glucose as a fuel source. Maybe we're looking to improve our VO2 max or just our ability to operate above our lactate threshold. Now the issue is that if you don't do enough higher speed or high intensity work, you're not going to develop your ability to run faster. However, if you do too much of it, you may put yourself at a higher risk of injury because there is a lot of load going through your body, obviously your lower limbs, when you're doing higher speed running. Now on the other hand, if we look at lower intensity running, because you're able to run for longer distances, you may start to increase the volume of your running too much, which again can put you at risk of injury. So it's always a bit of a balancing act, but thankfully we've learned a lot over time to help reduce the risk of injuries. And what we usually find is that having a balance between some lower to moderate and then some high intensity work in our training routines is going to be what is optimal for improving our performance over time without increasing or reducing the likelihood of injury. So when it comes to actually prescribing heart rate zones for people to work in, a common measure of this is using the classic formula 220 minus your age. Now whilst this might give us a good bandwidth to work within, we could use another formula which isn't too far off, where you basically multiply your age by 0.7 and minus that from 208. This is what I use for myself and some of my clients. So for example, my max heart rate would be 188. So when I'm trying to calculate my heart rate zones, let's say I want to be working in zone 2, which would be about 60 to 70, 75% of what my max heart rate would be, I would times that max heart rate by 0.6 to get the minimum range, and then 0.7 or 0.75 to get the maximum range, and that would be my bandwidth to work within. Now when we look at doing higher intensity training, it is the same thing. So something that I see with more of these advanced runners and athletes is that they're using things like lactate threshold, they're using VO2 max testing, they're using more advanced protocols to actually predict what their heart rate max would be. However, if you're a beginner runner, you're probably going to find a ramp protocol test where you're actually achieving your max heart rate to be quite grueling. Now on that topic, what we look at when we're doing our low intensity running, zones 1, zones 2, this is predominantly using fats as a fuel source. Therefore we can do it for a longer period of time. So when we look at actually using fats or oxidizing them as a fuel source, we can do this for hours and days. When it comes to increasing exercise intensity, say we're heading to or north of around 80 to 85% of what our max heart rate would be, we start to produce or start to utilize more glucose as a fuel source, and we only have limited stores of this in our body, whereas we obviously have a lot more excess body fat to utilize, especially if you're an individual with more adipose tissue. So when we look at running an actual event over time, what you're going to notice is that if you're doing a half marathon or a marathon, you may be running at a high intensity, but you'll start to fatigue. And this is because those glycogen stores are starting to deplete, and then your running speed is going to slow down. Whereas if you're running at a lower intensity, say you're doing an easy run or a zone 2 run, you can maintain this for a longer period of time and sustain that, which is why it's important to have this as a part of your programming. As we talked about at the start, a lot of the time this is going to be slower running. We're building up tissue tolerance here, so you can extend those long runs over time, and you might be building up to a half marathon or marathon distance, or it could even be 5, 10K run, whatever it may be. So it is an important aspect of your training, doing that lower to and moderate intensity work, But then we also look at the higher intensity running as well to develop some more neuromuscular efficiency, to build up some more tolerance to higher running speeds and coordination. So as always, it's going to be a balancing act between finding what you can handle at this point, how you periodize it over time, and how that would fit into your individual training plan. So now when we go into the actual heart rate zones, we have zone 1, which is 50 to 60%, zone 2, which is 60 to 70%, zone 3, which is 70 to 80%, zone 4, which is 80 to 90, and then zone 5, which is 90 to 100%. So as we start to increase our intensity, we start to rely more on glucose. However, that doesn't mean that when I'm in zone 2 and I move to zone 3 that I'm not burning any fats at all. It just means that I'm burning less fats, and then the ratio starts to bias more towards carbohydrate as a fuel source. And then as I extend up into zone 4 and zone 5, it starts to increase the dominance of carbohydrates. Therefore I deplete them, therefore I can't sustain those efforts for longer periods of time. So if you're looking to estimate your own heart rate max, you can look at using 220 minus your age. You could look at using 0.7 multiplied by your age, taking that away from 208. So if you are just looking at heart rate zones, those are some methods you can look at. And then when it comes to prescribing them, we have those 5 zones to work in. And when we look at each of them, let's say zone 1 could be an easy run, zone 2 could be a long run, moving into zone 3 as well. As you move into zone 4, we're starting to look at moving above the lactate threshold into full work there. And then we look at zone 5, we're starting to look at VO2 max work as well. Dependent on where you're at in a training program and your experience as a runner, you're probably not going to be doing as much of the higher intensity work to begin with. Another thing to note here is that as a beginner, you may struggle to actually keep your heart rate down in zone 1 or zone 2 if you are doing some base running or some long runs. So you may even have to substitute this for doing some cycling or some walk run methods. Otherwise, if you can maintain it, you may just have to run very slow, and it's hardly going to feel like you're running at all. Hopefully this clears up a lot of questions that you guys have when it comes to heart rate zones with running, what they do, why they're important, and also how you can predict your heart rate max, your running zones, and then how you can use that to prescribe your own training program. Thank you for your input, Ruby.